Howdy, it's Kyle talking about Oregon. In this video, I'll be going over various aspects of the geography of the state. I'll be talking about the cities and the urban landscape. I'll be going over the physical geography to include the national parks, beaches, volcanoes, climate, and natural disasters. I'll be going over various aspects of the economy of the state to include the industries that drive the economy, tax rates, agriculture, and the companies that are headquartered there. I'll also be going over various aspects of the culture to include the signature foods. So if you're interested in learning more about the Beaver State, this is the video for you. Oregon sits along the Pacific coast. It ranks 10th in terms of area, just smaller than Wyoming, just larger than Idaho. With a population of about 4.3 million people, it ranks 27th in the U.S. The vast majority of the population of the state lives along the Interstate 5 corridor or in the western one-third of the state. It became a state in 1859 and was the 33rd state admitted to the Union. It's the only state in the country that has a two-sided flag, so each side of the flag is different, which I totally missed for my video on ranking the flags, but either way, it's still a pretty ugly flag. The capital city is Salem. It has a population of about 177,000 people, and the overall Salem metro area has about 442,000 people. However, being that Salem isn't that far from Portland, and there really isn't that much space between the northern Salem suburbs and the southern Portland suburbs, the Salem metro area is usually added to the Portland metro area to form the Portland Consolidated metro area. It has an interesting downtown. There aren't any really tall buildings there because there's a code where you can't have any buildings taller than the Capitol building, and the Capitol building is pretty strange looking, and I think it's a pretty cool looking building, but I don't think it makes for a great state capitol. It's kind of strange looking. But either way, Salem is a pretty funky city. It's got a lot of nice, interesting shops and stuff downtown. And being that it's in Oregon, very outdoors oriented, there's a lot of hiking and biking trails within the city or just outside of the city. Lots of water there, great spots for paddling. Silver Falls State Park is really beautiful right nearby. Detroit Lake is a big old lake sitting right there. And the overall city is just very nature oriented, which you would expect for Oregon. The largest city in the state is Portland with about 663,000 people. It's the 26th largest city in the country. It's part of Multnomah County, which has about 821,000 people. So the Portland metropolitan area has about 2.5 million people, which ranks at 25th in the U.S. However, 500,000 of those are across the border in Washington state. If you add the Salem metro area to the overall greater Portland area, there are just under 3 million people in the entire metro, which makes it 21st in the U.S. It has an above average cost of living. The median house value is about $450,000. There's a 12% poverty rate, and the household income is $77,000 per year. Portland is well known for being kind of a funky city that marches to the beat of its own drum, and there are a lot of great neighborhoods in the city that reflect that. The downtown is pretty interesting, the CBD area where all the high rises are, but there are a lot of kind of smaller pocket neighborhoods that really make the city so unique. There are two different gentrified neighborhoods within the city. The original gentrified neighborhood is the Pearl District, and this is kind of your old warehouse district. It was gentrified about 30 years ago, and now it's kind of local boutiques and galleries. The more recently gentrified area is called the Central East Side, and there's a lot of great restaurants and microbreweries in this area and local shops, but it has been gentrified. Old Town Chinatown is your main nightlife area, a lot of bars and nightlife, and it's much younger and cooler than some of the other more upscale type areas. Another interesting neighborhood is called Alberta, and there's a lot of eclectic restaurants and shops in this little neighborhood. Another interesting neighborhood that's a little more rough around the edges is centered around Division and Clinton Streets, and this is more of your shabby chic kind of neighborhood. There's a fairly large Japanese population. A lot of Japanese immigrants came to Portland in the late 1800s, and fast forward to today, there's several ramen and many sushi restaurants all throughout the city, and it's got the oldest tofu house in the country, and it's also got a really nice Japanese tea garden there as well. Some of the highlights of Portland include Powell's Books, which is one of the greatest bookstores in the country. There are at least 7 used record shops in the city as well. And it also happens to be the city with the most number of strip clubs per capita in the U.S. But it's also one of the most forested cities in the country. Lots of parks and protected areas. Forest Park is the biggest one. It's one of the largest wilderness parks in the U.S. It's over 5,000 acres and has over 70 miles of trails. Something else that's pretty interesting in the area is called Government Island, and it's literally an island in the middle of the Columbia River. It's about 1,800 acres, and it's only accessible by boat, but there's hiking and camping on the island. So Portland is a city that does things its own way, and they don't care what you think. The next largest metro area in the state is the Eugene Springfield area. The city of Eugene has about 176,000 people. Springfield has about 65,000, and overall Lane County, which they both lie, has about 390,000 people. It has an average cost of living compared to other cities in this size range. The median house value is about $330,000 and it has a 17% poverty rate, which might seem kind of high, but it is a college town, and college towns always have a higher poverty rate. Its nickname is Tracktown USA, and there's lots of running trails in the city, running clubs, and with it being home to Nike Shoe Company, you can kind of expect it to be a big area for running. The downtown is okay. It's pretty interesting. There's an area called the Alton Baker Park right along the riverfront there. The gentrified area is called Whitaker. It's former industrial. Now it's a lot of breweries, restaurants, and pubs, and there's over 20 microbreweries in the city. Another cool spot is called Kesey Square. There's lots of food trucks there and local restaurants. And being a college town, it has plenty of college town type things like record shops, bookstores, vintage stores, funky boutiques, and there's even a pinball bar there, which is my kind of thing. And just like most other cities in Oregon, it's very outdoors oriented, a lot of walking and biking trails and just people out being fit, and that's pretty common for Oregon, including Eugene. The next largest city in the state is Bend, with a population of about 106,000 people. It's the largest city in the state that isn't located right along Interstate 5, and it's kind of right in the middle of the state. It's been growing quite a bit. It's been one of the top spots for people to move to in the West, and actually we had a chance to move there ourselves. It offers basically everything that Chattanooga does, with only 1/3 the population. But because it is a popular spot, it is becoming more expensive. The median house value is $430,000, which is really high for a town of its size. The overall cost of living is above average. There's a 10% poverty rate, but there's a very low crime rate as well. Back in the day, it was a lumber town, very blue-collar oriented. Now it's a very popular relocation place, a lot of outdoor activities. It's big for mountain biking and road cycling, and just surrounded by mountains all around it. Some of the most beautiful scenery you're going to see, so I can totally understand why people are moving there. The next largest city in the state is Medford, in the southern portion of the state, has about 85,000 people living there, and Jackson County, in which it lies, has about 225,000 people, and this overall area is known as the Rogue Valley Metro. It's a little more rough and tumble than some of the other parts of the state, so if you're familiar with some of the Central Valley towns in California, it's kind of like that. It's much more agriculture oriented than some of the other parts of the state, but it is still kind of expensive. There's a median house value of about $315,000, and there's a 14% poverty rate with an above average crime rate for a city of its size. But just like the rest of Oregon, there's a lot of great nearby outdoor stuff. It's the gateway to Crater Lake National Park. It's about an hour and a half away, and there's other national monuments that are pretty close to Medford as well. So the city is growing, but not nearly as much as other parts of Oregon. The next largest population center in the state is the Corvallis-Albany area. Corvallis has about 60,000 people, and Albany has about 57,000 people. Corvallis is the college town for Oregon State University, and Albany is a little more of a blue-collar type town nearby. But with Corvallis being pretty much just a college town, almost everything there is geared towards students, including some of the restaurants and bars and coffee shops. And there are a bunch of other small towns throughout the state. I certainly can't go over all of them, but a couple things that are pretty interesting. One is that very few people live along the coast. So most coastal states, most of the people live along the coast, but in Oregon, it's only a couple 100,000 people that live along the coast. Most people live inland in the valley. There are also a decent number of small towns right along the Columbia River, which forms the border with Washington State. But most of the eastern and pretty much all of the southeastern portion of the state is very lightly populated. There's only a couple of 100,000 people in the entire eastern half of the state. Between the 2010 and 2020 census, Oregon was the 12th fastest growing state in the country, and it continues to grow today. Now I want to get into some of the physical geography of Oregon, and it's well known for being one of the most beautiful states in the country. And if you want to make an argument that it's the most beautiful state in the country, well, I'm listening. But between the forests, the beaches, the mountains, lakes, rivers, and deserts, the whole state is very beautiful, and you'll be hard-pressed to find a part of Oregon that's ugly. There's one national park in Oregon, Crater Lake National Park, in the southwestern portion of the state, and it protects a beautiful lake and the mountain and the surrounding wilderness. The lake itself is actually a caldera, not a crater, but it's 1,949 feet deep. It's the deepest lake in the U.S. It's the 9th deepest lake in the world for maximum depth, and it's the 3rd deepest lake in the world for average depth. The average depth is 1,148 feet. However, it's not really a very big lake in terms of area. It's not one of the 100 largest lakes in the U.S., and there are literally thousands of lakes larger than Crater Lake worldwide. So with the lake being extremely deep and not very big, it's the lake that has the highest depth to area ratio in the entire world. So Crater Lake's the only national park, but there are many other national monuments and national recreation areas throughout the state. Oregon Caves National Monument is in the southwestern corner of the state, and it protects a nice area with some beautiful caves. Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area sits right along the coast and just a huge area of sand dunes formed by offshore winds. Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument sits along the south-central portion of the state right along the California border, another gorgeous area of mountains and woods. The Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area sits along the Columbia River, which forms the border with Washington State, another beautiful area with a river carved out a huge gorge. Newberry National Volcanic Monument is an essential part of the state, and it protects another volcano and a giant lake associated with it. Hells Canyon National Recreation Area is in the northeastern corner of the state on the Idaho border, just a vast wilderness, beautiful scenery, and a great place to float down the river. The Three Sisters Wilderness Area is a wilderness area that protects several volcanoes that are referred to as the Three Sisters, the North Sister, Middle Sister, and South Sister, all three of which are active volcanoes. Most of the southeastern portion of the state is high desert, so it's higher elevation but still very dry. And this part of the state is home to the Hart Mountain Antelope Range and the Mallard National Wildlife Refuge. The highest peak in the state is Mount Hood at 11,239 feet. It's the lowest, highest elevation of all the states in the West. All of the other states in the western U.S. have a peak that's over 12,600 feet. In terms of the major rivers of the state, the Columbia River forms most of the northern border with Washington State and is one of the biggest rivers in the entire U.S. About half of the eastern border with Idaho is the Snake River, which is another major carrier of water in the U.S. And most of the people in the state live along the Willamette River and the Willamette River Valley, which includes Portland, Salem, Corvallis, Eugene, and Springfield. So even though Oregon is a coastal state, the vast majority of the population lives along a river. In terms of the Oregon coast, it's arguably the most beautiful coastline in the entire U.S. There are over 80 state parks located along the coast, so it protects a lot of beautiful beaches. And that whole drive along U.S. Highway 101, which parallels the coast, is one of the most beautiful drives in the country. In terms of natural disasters, Oregon actually does fare pretty well. The biggest concern are wildfires. Those have been getting worse over the past decade or so, but that is the biggest concern. But as long as you don't live in an area that's along the urban wildland interface, you're not going to be at a huge risk of wildfires. There have been many big ones this century, but 2018 and 2020 were two of the worst years for wildfires. Flooding is not a huge concern there, but back in 2012 there was a huge flood from record rainfall that occurred in the state. And you might be surprised to learn that Oregon doesn't really have a huge earthquake threat, even though it sits along the west coast. The last major earthquake was in 1993 outside of Klamath Falls, and it was a 6.0 on the moment scale, which is kind of like the Richter scale. However, Portland and the major urban centers in the state do not face a huge earthquake threat. However, with it being along the west coast, there could be a huge earthquake in northwestern California or western Washington, and you would certainly feel it in Oregon. And as I alluded to before, there are a bunch of volcanoes in the state, including many that are active. And so even though volcanoes have the highest potential threat in terms of a natural disaster, they erupt very seldom. There are 41 volcanoes in Oregon, and some of the most high-threat active ones include Mount Hood, Mount Mazama, which is the actual name of the mountain where Crater Lake is, Newberry Shield Volcano, the Three Sisters, which counts as one volcanic system, Mount McLaughlin, and Mount Jefferson. So even though most people in Oregon don't face a big earthquake threat from your typical fault line earthquakes, you can of course get a huge earthquake as a result of a volcanic eruption. In terms of the climate, it's pretty mild throughout most of the state where most of the people live, although it can certainly get really cold in the higher elevations and in some of the high desert areas in the southeastern portion of the state. For example, the highest average temperature for any month in Portland is only 80 degrees, and the coldest average temperature for any month is only 45 degrees, so it's always pretty mild. Areas along the coast usually have no month where the highest average temperature is over 70 degrees, and the coldest month has a high temperature of in the 50s. And with the exception of the higher elevations and the eastern portions of the state, there really isn't that much snow in the state, although it does get quite a bit of rain in the winter. Bend is the only major population center in the state that does have a pretty cold winter. You have warm summers there, chilly winters, but you get plenty of snow in Bend. So if you don't like it hot and you don't like it cold, Oregon's a great place for you. Okay, so now I want to get into the economy of Oregon, and the economy tends to rank above average in most economic indicators. It tends to outperform most of the other states in its size range. The economy is fairly well diversified with high-tech, manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism being major parts, and there's also a pretty interesting tax structure in the state. So let's talk about the money in Oregon. The GDP of the state is approximately $250 billion per year, which ranks it 24th in the U.S. It's ahead of South Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana, and Kentucky, which all have more people. It has a household income of $63,000 per year, which ranks it 20th in the U.S., and there's an 11% poverty rate, which ranks it 24th in the U.S. Up until the 1970s and 1980s, timber was the largest sector of the economy, but that sector has gone down quite a bit in the past 30, 40 years or so, and the state has moved more towards manufacturing and high tech in terms of the economy. Although timber is still an important part of the economy, Oregon produces more than 10% of all of the lumber in the U.S. There is some natural gas in the state with very little oil and coal, and about 2/3 of all the electricity production in the state is done by hydropower. Some of the largest companies headquartered in the state include Nike Apparel, which is the largest company in the state, Daimler Trucks and Buses, which is essentially Mercedes-Benz trucks and buses, Precision Cast Parts, which does metal fabrication for aerospace and defense, Fred Meyer grocery stores and superstores, Lithia Motors, which is a nationwide auto seller, Les Schwab Tire Centers, Columbia Sportswear, Reese's Fine Foods and Food Service, and Adidas' North American headquarters is in Oregon as well. And also Intel is a huge computer company. It's not headquartered in Oregon, but it's a major employer for the state. Tourism is an important part of the economy as well, especially some of the outdoor stuff. So the national parks I was talking about before, the coastal areas, some of the cities. So just a lot of great outdoor type tourism stuff to make that an important part of the economy as well. And Oregon is also a very important state in terms of agriculture. It has a $6 billion annual agricultural economy, which ranks it 28th in the U.S. It's a number 5 producer of squash in the U.S. It's a number 4 producer of both cranberries and strawberries. It's the number 3 producer of cherries and hops. It's the number 2 producer of pears, spearmint, and onions. And it's the number 1 producer of blackberries, blueberries, peppermint, Christmas trees, and grass seed. And it's also the number 1 producer of hazelnuts. It's the only state in the country that produces hazelnuts commercially. It also has a large wine industry. Oregon ranks 5th in the country in terms of total wine production. And although due to federal laws it's not counted as agriculture, Oregon is one of the largest producers of cannabis in the U.S. with about $750 million per year in revenue from marijuana. So it's a major state in terms of crops and also dairy, but there isn't much in the way of livestock or grains, which is why it only ranks 28th overall in terms of ag. And so now for everyone's favorite category, and that's the taxes. Oregon has the single highest average state income tax rate in the country. It's essentially a 9% rate for everybody and a 10% rate for households that make over $250,000 per year. So a really high income tax, but there's zero sales tax in the state. And for me personally, this is my favorite type of tax structure. Oregon, Montana, and Delaware all have this where it's a high state income tax but no sales tax. I'd rather be socked in the gut once a year by the government instead of just mosquito bites all year long with sales tax. And so with the highest income tax and no sales tax, it makes perfect sense that the property tax is right in the middle. It's ranked 24th in the U.S. So Oregon's overall tax burden is a little above average, but nowhere near as much as you might think for the state that has the single highest average income tax rates in the country. So a diversified economy, along with what I think is a favorable tax structure, is why Oregon outpaces 4 states that are larger than it in terms of its overall economy. So now I want to get into some of the cultural aspects of Oregon, and the state is well known for doing things its own way, and it was the first state in the country to come up with some pretty interesting ideas. In the early 20th century, it was the first state to have citizen-driven ballot initiatives. So if you live in a state that has referendums or propositions or question 1 and 2 kind of stuff, that was all started in Oregon. Also in the early 20th century, it was the first state to implement citizen-driven politician recalls and removals. So if you want to recall or remove a politician, that started with Oregon. It was the first state to adopt a recycling program back in 1971. Back in the 1990s, it was the first state to legalize the right to die or doctor-assisted suicide. And back in 2020, voters voted to decriminalize all drugs. So if you're you're in possession of drugs, you're going to get a ticket, like a civil penalty, as opposed to going to prison for years like you do in literally every other state. So some pretty interesting ideas that come out of Oregon, but that's kind of what you would expect coming from a pretty strange state like that. And the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video are some of the signature foods of the state. And with the state being such a huge producer of blackberries, blueberries, cranberries, strawberries, marionberries, all the different types of berries, as well as peppermint and spearmint. So you can imagine a lot of sweets and a lot of pies coming out of these berries is pretty well known for those, especially marionberry pie, really good stuff. And just being along the coast, of course, you're going to have a lot of great seafood. It's well known for its Dungeness crab. It's the #1 producer of Dungeness crab in the country. And with the state being the #1 producer of hazelnuts, the only state in the country that produces them commercially, you're of course going to have a lot of things that have hazelnut in them, including chocolate and coffee, so other things that have hazelnut flavor. And with, of course, being a major producer of marijuana, a lot of marijuana edibles throughout the state as well. And to go along with the sweets and edibles and unhealthy stuff, there's a pretty well-known place in Portland called Voodoo Donuts, which is, it's a pretty famous donut shop. It's got these crazy concoction donuts that people travel from miles around to come to. I've never had one, but apparently they're all the rage. So it's kind of interesting that the state that has all these outdoor activities, Tracktown USA, Nike, Adidas, all these people that are fit, long life expectancy, but their signature foods are pretty much all junk foods and sweets, except for that wonderful Dungeness crab. So that's my overview of Oregon. It's a wonderful state. It's a beautiful state. It's one of my favorite states in the country. I love that no sales tax and just gorgeous outdoor scenery wherever you go. You can go from beaches to mountains to high desert, just all within the same day. And being from California, people think we're like the weirdest and craziest people. They're doing like the most ridiculous things. Like, wait, what about them up there? They're even weirder and crazier than us. So, I mean, yeah, I love Oregon. I just love how it's just unique. They don't really care what other people think about it. So, I just like that kind of mentality of just doing things the way you want to do them. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about U.S. geography. I'm talking about states like this. I'm comparing and contrasting cities, counties, and states in all kinds of different categories, ranking things in all kinds of different categories, talking about cross-country road tripping, and just everything I talk about comes from a little more nerdy type perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out.